Light, Wake of the Bellerophon by T.B. Dahl. Chapter 2. A peculiar gentleness as Thomas grew, his nature emerged by degrees, like a coast seen through lifting fog. He laughed quickly. He resisted correction. He forgave animals before people. He listened when adults assumed he had gone. This last habit caused difficulties. Thomas developed the unnerving practice of appearing silently beside conversations and revealing by one small question that he had heard everything worth hiding. One morning, Grace stood in the scullery whispering with the dairymaid about Mrs. Penruddock's niece, a red ribbon, and a cooper's apprentice from across the creek. Thomas appeared at Grace's elbow. "Why did she climb out the window?" Thomas asked. The dairymaid made a sound like a dropped kettle. Grace clutched her apron. "Lord save us," Grace muttered. "He's like a ship's ghost, this one." Thomas looked pleased. No one had told him what a ship's ghost was, but he understood from the reaction that it had rank. For all his mischief, Thomas had a peculiar gentleness with creatures. The kitchen cat, whose name was Admiral because it possessed no affection and expected obedience, permitted Thomas to stroke its back. This was viewed by the household as either a miracle or an alliance. Thomas fed Admiral bits of fish under the table. Admiral accepted them without gratitude. When mice were found nesting in the pantry, Anne ordered traps set. Thomas stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the tiny pink bodies wriggling in the straw. "No," Thomas said. Anne crouched beside him. "They will spoil the stores, my love." Thomas's lower lip trembled, though no tears fell yet. "They are small." James, summoned to deal with the matter, looked at the mice, then at his son, then at Anne. James sighed. A quarter of an hour later, Lieutenant Oxenham carried a small wooden box to the far end of the orchard and released His Majesty's enemies beneath the hedge. The mice disappeared. Mice have that habit. People make merciful arrangements for them, and they repay civilization by vanishing into holes and considering cheese. Thomas watched solemnly. "Will they be safe?" James closed the box. "Safer than if they had stayed in your mother's pantry." Thomas nodded. This satisfied him for the moment. At 3 years old, Thomas was taken by James to watch a neighbour's field being ploughed. The horse drawing the plough was a vast, ill-tempered creature named Samson. Samson had bitten one groom, kicked a gate to pieces, and dragged a cart sideways through a hedge for reasons of his own. Everyone respected him. Respect is often what people call fear when the feared object is useful. The ploughman saw Thomas approach and raised one hand. "Careful, little master." Thomas walked straight to Samson's flank and laid one small hand on the horse's damp side. James's breath caught. The ploughman reached forward. Samson lowered his head. The great horse snuffled Thomas's hair. Thomas patted him once. "Good horse," Thomas said. Samson exhaled warmly over the boy's face. The ploughman removed his hat. "Well," he said. "I'll be damned." James looked at Thomas for a long moment. That evening by the hearth, James told Anne, "He stands his ground." Anne looked across at Thomas, who sat on the rug drawing chalk marks on a slate. "He is 3, Anne said. James leaned back in his chair. Fearlessness tempered by caution. That is valuable. Anne threaded her needle, or he did not know the horse might crush him. James accepted this as a possible interpretation, and therefore ignored it. Eliza Oxenham arrived in the autumn of 1785. Her coming was less storm-ridden than Thomas's, though Greystone House still creaked through the night in sympathy, and James still paced the parlour until the floorboards considered rebellion. When Anne was finally settled in the best chamber with a swaddled girl in her arms, Thomas was brought in to inspect the newcomer. He was 3 years old, dark-haired, narrow-shouldered, and serious. He stood beside the bed and looked at Eliza's pink face. "Mine?" Thomas asked. Anne adjusted the bundle. "She is your sister." Thomas considered this. "Mine?" he repeated. James, from the foot of the bed, coughed into his hand. Anne said, "In a manner of speaking, you must be gentle with her." Thomas leaned closer. Eliza opened her mouth and yawned. Thomas took one step back. "She has no teeth?" he said. "No," Anne said. "Not yet." Thomas frowned. "How does she eat apples?" "She does not." Thomas looked at his sister again. His expression suggested concern for her prospects. In the months that followed, Thomas discovered that Eliza's presence altered the household balance in his favor. Anne was often occupied. Grace was often occupied. The baby required feeding, changing, rocking, burping, bathing, soothing, and being admired by visitors who described her as a little angel, though she cried with the vigor of a boatswain's whistle. Thomas gained stretches of freedom. He used them. He wandered the orchard. He opened cupboards. He sat with James's old navigation primer and turned the pages, though he could not yet read half the words. He liked the diagrams. Lines, circles, angles, stars, and ships pleased him. They implied that the world had rules if one stared long enough. By the time Eliza could sit upright, she had become fixed upon him. Her grey eyes followed him across any room. When Thomas entered, her face opened in delight. "Ta!" Eliza called one spring morning, waving both hands from her blanket. "Tutu." Thomas was constructing a fort from cushions. He looked up sharply. Anne sat nearby with her mending. "She wants you," Anne said. Thomas studied his sister. Eliza bounced once and reached for him. He crawled to her blanket. She seized a handful of his hair. Thomas winced but did not pull away. "Careful, Liza," Thomas said with grave authority. "I'll show you how to build properly." He placed one cushion beside her. Eliza knocked it over. Thomas looked at the fallen cushion. Then at Eliza, then at Anne. "She is French," Thomas said. Anne lowered her sewing. "Thomas." They knocked things down. From the doorway, James made the mistake of laughing. The rhythm of Greystone House changed with James's naval duties. When James was away, the house became Anne's kingdom. She governed it without display. She taught Thomas letters at the kitchen table, numbers by the pantry shelves, scripture from the Bible, manners before visitors, and patience whenever patience could be cornered and forced upon him. She allowed him to help in the dairy, though help often meant stirring the wrong thing, dropping the right thing, or asking why butter would not arrive faster if everyone wanted it. When James was at sea, Thomas climbed the orchard wall and watched the distant waters of Plymouth Sound. He could not always see the ships clearly. Sometimes he saw only a pale sail, a dark hull, a suggestion of masts beyond the haze. Still he watched. Children are excellent watchers when waiting for someone they love. They have not yet learned the adult art of pretending not to count the hours. When James returned on half-pay, Greystone House filled with another weather, boots in the passage, sea chests, charts, logbooks, the smell of tarred line and wool dampened by spray. James brought stories, instructions, corrections, and the restless energy of a man ashore who had not quite stopped feeling deck planks beneath his feet. He took Thomas, walking along the cliff paths. He pointed out luggers, fishing smacks, revenue cutters, colliers, brigs, and the great ships of the line that lay at Plymouth, or moved through the channel like floating towns with violent manners. One bright morning, when Thomas was 4.5, father and son sat on a grassy promontory above the Yelm. The sea below flashed under the sun. A ship stood out from Plymouth, her canvas set with practised neatness, her hull dark, her ports in ordered rows. James pointed. "There. That is a 74. Thomas squinted. "A great ship." "A third-rate ship of the line," James said. "The backbone of the fleet. Count her gun ports." Thomas lifted one small hand, finger moving. 18? 19? 20? "Not all are visible from here," James said. "But you have the right method." Thomas kept staring. The 74 moved slowly, majestically, with a kind of awful purpose. Even at distance, she seemed less built than summoned. Thomas said, "Will you command one some day, Papa?" James did not answer immediately. He took a blade of grass between thumb and forefinger and split it down the middle. "That would require post-rank," James said. "And post-rank requires service, luck, action, patronage, timing, and a number of gentlemen in London remembering one's name at the correct moment. The sea is simple compared with land offices." Thomas turned to him. James forced a small smile. "But you," James said, touching the boy's shoulder, "you might well do it. Begin early. Good sea time. Good mathematics. A captain servant first, then midshipman. Lieutenant by 18 or 19 if you are diligent, and fortune does not have indigestion. Thomas absorbed this. When can I go to sea? James laughed once. Not yet. Your mother would have my head. Would she put it on the gate? No, James said. Your mother is a gentlewoman. She would write to my commanding officer first. Thomas accepted this. For a while they watched the 74 stand out under the morning light. Then Thomas pointed toward a smaller vessel tacking closer to the Yelm. Look, Papa, is that a smuggler? James's hand stilled in the grass. Why would you ask that? Thomas kept his eyes on the vessel. Grace told the dairymaid that Tanner's boy helps run goods up from Wembury on nights. James's voice cooled. Did she? Thomas glanced at him. Something had shifted. He did not yet know what, but children hear changes in adult voices as sailors hear changes in rigging. James said, You need not concern yourself with such talk. Why? Because smuggling is against the law. Thomas looked back at the small vessel. The sail flashed white. The hull dipped in a swell. James continued, It is no occupation for a gentleman, nor for the son of a king's officer. Thomas nodded, but his eyes had sharpened. He had noticed already that village life possessed currents below the visible tide. Conversation stopped when certain men entered. Doors opened late on moonless nights. Barrels appeared in barns without having passed along roads in daylight. Women who condemned sin on Sunday bought excellent French lace on Monday and asked no questions regarding its spiritual journey. The world, Thomas was learning, had rules. It also had exceptions. Adults preferred not to discuss which was which. Life at Greystone House followed the seasons: planting, hay, apples, preserving, cider, frost, lambing, mending, storms, Sunday bells, market days, salt wind in the hedges, ash in the hearth. The house held them all in its grey stone grip. Thomas lengthened. His limbs remained wiry, his frame narrow but firm. His dark hair would not lie flat for more than a quarter of an hour. His sea-green eyes missed very little and forgave even less when an explanation failed to satisfy him. He became famous in the household for acquiring food. This was the polite term. Grace used others: fresh cakes, biscuits, apples, crusts, small cheeses, and once half a cold pasty disappeared despite every reasonable precaution. The objects were not stolen, according to Thomas. They were found. Found things occupied an uncertain moral harbour. One afternoon Grace discovered that 3 jam tarts had vanished from a tray she had left on the kitchen dresser. She had been gone only long enough to fetch wood. I swear he uses witchcraft, Grace said, hands on hips. 3 of them. Gone. Anne looked across the kitchen. Thomas sat at his slate near the hearth. His expression was peaceful. A red smear glistened at the corner of his mouth. Anne folded her arms. Thomas Oxenham. Thomas looked up. Yes, Mamma? Have you been stealing tarts? No, Mamma. Grace made a sound of outrage. Anne said, Then where are they? Thomas considered. A less careful child would have rushed. Thomas never rushed when invention was required. I found them, he said. Anne's brows lifted. Found them where? Thomas touched his slate pencil to his chin. They wanted to be eaten. James entered at that moment, carrying logbooks beneath one arm. He heard the last words and stopped. Thomas continued, gaining confidence. They told me so. James burst into laughter. Anne turned on him. James attempted to arrange his face into command. He failed. James said, There is a defence worthy of an admiralty court. The enemy vessel, my lords, positively begged to be captured. Anne said, Do not encourage piracy in the kitchen. Privateering, James said. If properly licensed. Thomas smiled, revealing the gap where one front tooth had recently fallen out. Anne pointed toward the basin. Wash your face. Thomas obeyed at once, which meant he had almost certainly eaten the tarts. At 5½ Thomas had grown into a handsome child, though handsomeness in boys mostly means they have recently been cleaned and have not yet found mud. He had his father's dark colouring and his mother's finer features. He had a quick mouth, quicker hands, and a mind that fastened on problems until they yielded or someone removed the problem from reach. James began teaching him navigation in earnest. Clear evenings in the orchard became lessons. James brought out an old Hadley quadrant, its brass dulled by age, its frame smelling faintly of polish and salt. Thomas handled it with the reverence other children reserved for sugar. James showed him the horizon, then the star, then the reflected image, then the angle. The instrument lets a man measure altitude, James said, the height of a heavenly body above the horizon. Thomas lifted the quadrant with both hands. It tells where you are. It helps. Why only helps? Because the sea dislikes certainty. Thomas looked toward the darkening west. This answer satisfied him more than most. Another evening, James stood with Thomas near the orchard wall and explained the horizon. The distance to the horizon in nautical miles is approximately the square root of your height of eye in feet multiplied by 1.17. Thomas frowned. The frown deepened. James waited. Teaching a child numbers required patience. Teaching Thomas required silence after the fuse had been lit. Thomas said, "If I stand on the cliff 20 feet above the water." James watched him working. "Then the square root is between 4 and 5, Thomas said slowly. 4.5 nearly, times 1.17. About 5.2 nautical miles, James said. Thomas looked up. "That is not very far." "No," James said. "Which is why men climb masts, build lighthouses, and still run aground." Bedtime brought stories. James sat beside Thomas's bed while candlelight trembled over the low ceiling. He told of the Caribbean, where the water could be blue enough to seem dishonest. He told of Newfoundland fog, thick as wet wool. He told of convoy duty, prize money, fever, reefs, privateers, Spanish gunboats, and one goat aboard a sloop that had eaten part of the sailing orders and was afterwards treated with unusual suspicion by the master. Thomas liked the engagements best. "Tell about the French frigate again," Thomas would say, gripping the blanket beneath his chin. "The one that struck her colours after the 9-pounders. James obliged. The action had been minor in official correspondence, but fathers are not official correspondents. By the time James finished, the sea was higher, the guns louder, the Frenchmen more numerous, and James's own part less modest than it would have been in daylight. Anne sometimes listened from the doorway. Her face held fondness, exasperation, and something else she tucked away before either of them could see it. Not all days were lessons, sums, and stories. As Thomas neared his 6th birthday, the countryside around Greystone House became his territory. He walked lanes between high hedge banks. He searched ditches. He climbed orchard walls. He returned with stones, feathers, seed pods, snail shells, bits of blue pottery, and once a grass snake looped calmly around his wrist. Anne found him in the passage with it. She stopped. The snake lifted its head. Thomas lifted his also. "It is friendly, Mamma." Anne's hand went to the wall. "I see." "I spoke to it softly," Thomas explained. "It decided not to bite." "That was considerate. It might get cold outside. Winter is coming." Anne kept her voice measured. Measured voices are useful when one's son is wearing a serpent. "Thomas, please put that creature back where you found it." Thomas looked down at the snake. The snake looked at no one in particular. James arrived behind Anne and took in the scene. "Ah," James said. Anne did not look away from the snake. "James?" James moved carefully. "Snakes sleep through winter, Tom. They find a safe hole and curl up until spring." Thomas hesitated. "Truly? Truly? You are not saying that only because Mama wishes it gone?" James considered lying and rejected it. The snake was present. "I am saying it because it is so, and because your mother wishes it gone." Thomas accepted this distinction. James unwound the snake gently from Thomas's wrist. Together, father and son carried it to the south orchard wall and found a warm crack between the stones. Thomas crouched as the snake slid into the dark. "You would not make me sleep outside in winter," Thomas told it. "Mama is very kind once you know her." James coughed into his sleeve. The excursions grew longer. Thomas visited neighboring farms, followed shepherds, inspected barns, asked ploughmen questions, and charmed his way into kitchens by appearing hungry, interested, and innocent. The combination had opened stronger doors than his. An elderly shepherd named Abel took to him. Abel showed Thomas which hedgerow herbs eased swelling, which leaves soothed stings, which berries were best admired and not eaten, and how sheep could look foolish while making decisions that would ruin a man's afternoon. One evening, James came to collect Thomas and found him sitting beside Abel's old dog, scratching the animal behind one ragged ear. "That dog snaps at everyone," Abel said. Thomas looked up. "He does not snap if you ask first." Abel spat neatly into the dust. "Your boy has a way about him, Lieutenant." James watched Thomas and the dog. "He has always been so." "Animals sense it," Abel said. "Ship's cats will take to him. Goats too, if he has the misfortune to meet naval goats. Even rats might think twice before sampling his hammock." Thomas looked interested. "Do rats sample hammocks?" James said, "Not if the hammock is properly guarded." Abel laughed. James smiled, but the words lodged somewhere in him. Thomas's quickness with numbers, his steadiness with animals, his habit of watching before acting, his fearlessness, imperfect but real, his hunger for the sea. James began to see a shape forming. Not certainty, never that. Only possibility. A narrow channel through uncertain water, post-rank, had escaped James. It might not escape Thomas. On a golden afternoon near the end of summer, just before Thomas's 6th birthday, the family picnicked in the orchard. Anne spread a blanket under the largest apple tree. Grace had packed cold meat, bread, cheese, early apples, and a small cake that Thomas inspected immediately and was forbidden to touch until after the meal. Eliza sat with a crust in one hand and a daisy in the other, attempting to decide which was food. Thomas lay on his stomach at the blanket's edge, watching a line of ants cross the grass. "They are like a crew," Thomas said. James leaned against the tree trunk with a cup of cider. "Are they?" "Each knows its duty." Anne arranged cheese on a plate. "Or each follows the one in front and hopes for the best." James lifted the cup. "Also like a crew?" Thomas watched the ants. One ant struggled with a crumb larger than its head. Another came to assist. Then a third. The crumb moved. Thomas smiled. Anne said, "Speaking of duty, I have spoken with the curate." Thomas did not look away from the ants. James looked at Anne. Anne continued, "He is willing to begin formal lessons with Thomas this Michaelmas. Latin, mathematics, proper penmanship." Thomas lifted his head at mathematics. "Will I learn navigation?" "In time," James said. "And stars?" "In time." Thomas rolled onto his back and looked up through the apple leaves. The sunlight broke into bright pieces overhead. "What comes first?" "Latin grammar," Anne said. Thomas's face changed. It did not become mutiny. It became the careful stillness before mutiny. James said, "First principles first, Tom. Letters, sums, Euclid. A proper hand." Thomas frowned. "Why Latin?" "Because educated men are expected to know it," Anne said. "Do sailors speak Latin?" "Some captains do," James said. "Do storms?" "No." "Then why—" "Because," Anne said, with the calm of a woman who had anticipated this reef, "a mind must be trained before it can be trusted. Even the finest navigator must first master his letters and figures." Thomas stared upward. A bee moved among the apples. Eliza ate the daisy and seemed disappointed. James said, "Think of it as preparing for your sea career. No midshipman is trusted with a watch until he has proved himself in the basics." Thomas turned his head toward his father. "Then I will work hard." Anne's hand paused over the bread knife. Thomas said, "And then I can go to sea?" For a moment only the orchard answered. Leaves whispered. A rook called from beyond the wall. Somewhere down the hill, faint through the warm air, a boat knocked against its mooring. Anne resumed cutting the bread. "Not for many years yet," Anne said. "There is plenty of time." James reached across the blanket and touched her wrist. "One step at a time," James said to Thomas. "For now, apples." Anne handed Thomas one. He sat up and bit into it. Juice ran down his chin. His eyes drifted past the trees, beyond the garden wall, toward the distant glint of water between branches. For that instant, Thomas seemed balanced exactly between two worlds. One world held ants, apples, grass stains, stolen tarts. His sister's reaching hands, his mother's voice calling him in from rain, Grace's scolding, the kitchen cat's unwilling tolerance, the orchard wall warm from the sun. The other world waited beyond the creek. Canvas, gun smoke. Orders shouted into gale wind. Strange coasts. Dark water under stars. Men who watched the horizon because the horizon sometimes answered. Anne watched him. Her knife rested on the blanket. 6 years had passed since the storm beat against Greystone House, and Thomas first cried beneath its roof. 6 years had gone like spilled water into thirsty ground. How many remained before the sea took notice of him? Anne did not speak the thought. Mothers learn early which fears can be named and which must be folded away like linen for a season no one wishes to see. Thomas looked back at her and smiled through apple juice. Anne reached out and wiped his chin with her thumb. "Eat properly," Anne said. Thomas took another bite. Above them the apple leaves stirred. Beyond them the water flashed once in the sun and vanished. For now the orchard held. For now the sea waited. And the sea, like any patient creditor, had excellent memory.
The story continues in the next chapter, so make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with fellow book lovers.